first slide there. It does have to do, this is the right presentation for understanding American or United States foreign assistance. So, but we're starting here and you'll see why it has to do with the, my next presentation will be on Washington Goes to War, understanding the United States government. And actually all the government that you see, or the federal government, and even the state governments, it all starts with World War II. And that'll be my next presentation, I believe, sometime in November. But it will bring up particular elements of history, which sometimes we have forgotten. Just to give you a sneak preview, you know, the 1951, we had the United States Interstate Highway, and it's called the Eisenhower Interstate Highway, partly because there was a need, or seen need, of moving lots of equipment from coast to coast without having to use the railroads. You wanted to do things by truck. And if you remember, it's difficult to move things by truck because even here, you would have to go through cities to get through each point of the state. So, you know, people would have to go through downtown Mount Dora, for example, before the highways. In Florida, you're blessed with a number of great highways. Older places or across the United States, they don't have those even today. But that's what I'll be talking about, and also how Washington, D.C. grew to be what it was, or what it is, and why sometimes we still don't understand it. I'm a Foreign Service officer, retired in 2020, and so I'm not a Washington person, although technically I am. A Foreign Service officer is required to spend 20 out of 25 years career outside of the United States. So while being in the State Department, I have been out of the country actually for 23 of the 20 years. So most of them, 23 out of the 25 years, I've been outside of the United States. Partly because I wanted to avoid going to Washington. I did have one Washington tour, and it was with an intelligence-related entity. But more on that later. But countries that I've been to, it starts with places like Liberia, Nigeria, Bosnia, Bangladesh. We can go to, Sudan was my last. I went there twice. And 2 or 3 other countries. Mauritania, countries that you have to open up your atlas and sort of look at. But each one, most of them are in Africa. So let me start, if I can. This is the United States-Arizona Memorial in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And today is August 3rd. In 3 days, it will be August 6th. And 80 years ago, that was the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. So we're going, this is a historic time because that was it killed 150,000 people with one bomb and ended World War II. But it started when the Japanese, they started it, attacked Pearl Harbor. And back then, the way to deter people from attacking you is control of the seas, and you control the seas with battleships. And if you had battleships, you control the seas. And I'm just putting that here. And 9 of the United States battleships for the Pacific were in Pearl Harbor. Every one of them suffered damage. Some of them sank outright. Arizona, 2,403 sailors died in that one attack. Of them, 1,177 were on the ship and interred on the ship. So This has to do with foreign assistance because Roosevelt suffered a great, let's face it, it's a domestic political defeat. You were caught unawares, but he did two things. He called in late December a meeting of the chiefs of staff, and he fired a few admirals along the way, and he said, I want you within 6 months to attack the home islands of Japan. Now, battleships have all been suffered damage, and 100 other ships have been damaged. The fleet did not exist in the Pacific, but that's what he wanted. That was his domestic plan, and he told his chiefs of staff, figure it out. The reason I'm bringing this up is because capacity is a very important thing. Prevention, from the government point of view, is a very important thing. So, capacity was, let's say, diminished. In fact, the only thing they had going for them, one of them, there's several, was the carriers, which were unproven offensive weapons, were out at sea. They didn't suffer damage, but carriers have limited range. Plus, you would have to need the protection of battleships to get there. This has to do with capacity because, inter-service rivalry at the United States level and in all parts of any large organization is a very big impediment. Doolittle, who was in charge of one of the officers in the Army Air Corps, had the idea of using Navy ships with Army Air Corps bombers, which had the range, and attack the home islands. It succeeded. They were able to do that, but the type of cooperation was, at that time, unprecedented. And that signaled a new way of American fighting. But more on that later. The second most important part was, in February, Roosevelt had another meeting, another audacious meeting, because he said, I want you to plan for the occupation of post-war Japan. Now remember, this is only a few months after they had lost their fleet, and the war was not going well even then. It would take a while. The Doolittle raid happened in May, and they would have to wait until even further before other things changed. But the point is, this is the point. He wanted a foreign policy on post-war, how to deal with post-war Japan. The point is, that comes from an understanding of the domestic requirement. So I just want to leave you with this start, and this is just the preamble. Let me define foreign for you, because this is a talk about U.S. foreign assistance. This is the United States flag. There's no Florida flag, because in the United States, I tell people who are foreign, we have two governments in the United States. We have the state government and the federal government. Overseas, they deal with the federal government. Most Americans, on a day-to-day basis, actually deal only with the state government. When you leave the United States, our territory is only 12 miles from the shore. So you go to New Smyrna Beach, go 12 miles out, you're not in the United States. We don't have control over that, although we do, for other reasons. But that is the end of our international limit. We do have a 200-mile economic exclusion zone in which we control, by treaty, this is very recent, 200 miles out. And where if you go to Cuba, which is only 9 miles from Key West, you have to reach an understanding with another sovereign government as to where you're going to have your economic activity. And this is important because sovereignty, working with this other sovereign government requires us to understand that we have our domestic policy, we have our foreign policy, and I assert that 4/5 of our foreign policy is domestic, and we have to take care of the other part because of the sovereign governments we deal with. So the point is, 4/5, according to me, of foreign policy is domestic. 4/5 of foreign policy is domestic policy. The other thing is, and domestic foreign policy, we have to have capabilities. And for our purposes, I'll just say that there are 3 parts of foreign assistance, which is one of those foreign policy capacities. And foreign assistance, if you talk to anybody, they'll say there are 3 parts. There's going to be humanitarian, development, and military. Just very simple. I always say, when I talk about foreign policy, implicit in all that, it's always going to be America first. Always. But you have to deal with that other sovereign country and even the ungoverned space that is international waters, international space. Okay. This is understanding, that was all preamble. This is understanding U.S. foreign assistance, and the background to this slide is actually the United States Marines on the shores of Tripoli, and that happened in 1802. The reason they did this is that after the American Revolutionary War was completed, and we signed a peace treaty, which happened in 1783. Yorktown was in 81. We signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And we said, great, we're now a free nation. However, the problem is the Constitution wasn't even thought about. We only had states in charge of each other. And the states, and we had also disbanded the Army, the Continental Army, in 1783. We disbanded the Navy and sold off all the ships. And so foreign countries, the Barbary pirates, said, you're not being protected by the great British Navy. We can take any American ship. And the American ships had been always in the Mediterranean and around the world selling things like timber, tobacco, rice. We were feeding a lot of people. We were providing them with timber, which they didn't have because of our, not here in Florida, our inexhaustible timber up in the north. And so the Barbary pirates were just one of the groups that would seize unprotected American ships and sailors, hold them for ransom, and take the goods. This happened as early 1783 and continued even into the creation of the United States constitutional government in 1789. One of the first things the Constitution, the first act of Congress has to do with taking of oaths. The second act has to do with tariffs. Third act has to do with taxes. You see the major thing. The fourth act had to do with foreign relations. Up until then, this first budget was about $400 million in their money. Up to a quarter of that was used for protection, to pay off the Barbary pirates so they wouldn't attack American shipping. Even then, Washington said, we've got to do something. And he didn't do anything because there's nothing they could do without revenue. So finally, in his second term, 1794, the Navy was reconstituted, the Naval Act of 1794. Along with that, they also allowed for a company of Marines. However, as I said, this is in 1794. They built ships, or they started them. The ships were not completed until 1800. So it took 6 years for them to build the Navy and to practice and to train everyone. Finally, in 1802, they were ready, and they basically decided to act under a different president. So from Washington to John Adams, and finally, as soon as Thomas Jefferson took office, he says, we have the ships, we have the men, let's stop these pirates. This, again, just an illustration from that time. So protection money, capacity, or do something with that capacity. And it's costing a lot of money just to pay tribute, or financial tribute. One of the things that caused the Naval Act to pass was the fact that the raiding by the Barbary pirates reached a high point in 1793, where, as you see, there are 100 citizens and 10 American ships were seized. This is interesting because the American government were the ones that negotiated for the release and payment of the sailors and the ships. So you have the American government working on behalf of private individuals and paying them. I don't know if we would do that today, but back then things were different. Now I need to have a little wrinkle here because I've talked about foreign and I talked about American dollars going to pay for private things. Let's just bring up other things about assistance, things that the United States government does. One of them is the global positioning system. Anybody in the world can access it if they have a receiver. The idea here is that assistance? Well, is it assistance? You make your own judgment, but it is American assets, our technology, operated by our military, that anybody can basically know where they are, not get lost, where they can navigate their way on seas or on land. We do that, United States, and there's a lot of those. You see Captain Phillips. Freedom of the seas is, or was, depending on how close you follow foreign affairs, is guaranteed by the United States, or part of it, or part of the protection is by the United States. Maersk, Alabama, I say Maersk because that Alabama ship was recently purchased in the movie, was recently purchased by Maersk, which is a Dutch company. So you have an American military people operation supporting a foreign ship. Yes, they're American sailors, but the point is it's a foreign ship. The United States has been blessed with inventing a lot of great things. Things like, the telephone, or at least the telephone system. Do you know why, if when you do an international country code, we come up +1, and other countries are like number 99 plus 998? It's because the system is American system. And so under the International Telephone Union, we basically said, well, since we're number 1, we get to, and since we have the wherewithal, we're going to have our country code first. The same thing with the internet. We have ICANN, which is a private corporation. It used to be under the jurisdiction of the Department of Commerce. It is now an international company, but it's the International Corporation for Designing Names and Numbers. Things like .com or .gov or your country code, Norway, NO. The point is, the United States provides support for a lot of things which we take for granted. Is that assistance? Okay. Sometimes I've given you the preamble, and the reason I bring this up is because right now there are organizations United Nations, private, whatever, that are making these rules that govern how everything works. And the secret is if you're first or you invent it, you make the agenda. Not only do you make the agenda, you make the rules for the meetings, and you get to call or convene the meeting. Is this assistance, or is this just us being what we do? But the point is, it's like, if you've seen the play Hamilton, get me in that room. But you have to pay to get in that room, or you have to be the inventor to get in that room, or you have to be important, technically, to get in that room. So that's assistance, or is that direction? You can tell me. But the point is, this is part of the way the world works. Is, for example, name any activity. You can say, we'll get into humanitarian assistance, but the point is, you want to be the convener, you want to be in the agency, but you've got to pay for that privilege. I also noticed the capacity. This is about capacity. You have to be able to be in that room, speak the language, know the people, have someone who knows the other people to prepare your briefing points, and so that you know what other countries or they're not competitors, they're co-cooperators, whatever you want to call them. They're in that room. You got to know what their position is, because I've been there. That's what you want to do. Okay. Quickly, I said there are 3 parts to foreign assistance, and this is just government foreign assistance. It's military. We'll just do this very quickly because I'm not going to focus too much on it. This comes from just working with defense attaches and embassies. The defense attache, they're usually Army. Basically, you provide other countries with weapons, and they actually get passed through the State Department because they're either quote, obsolete, non-usable, whatever, or surplus. I won't get into reasons we can call them. But you want to have allies who think like you, who operate like you, who understand your tactics. And you work with them, and you understand their leadership, and you know how far you can trust them. Their capabilities of their individual units. And actually, this is the most important part, the second one, is when I call them, I want them to pick up the phone because they recognize my number. Because it doesn't always happen. I was in Sudan during the very last coup, and you see the coup going on, it says, gee, maybe I can call somebody. Well, all the phones have been disconnected, but the point is, I know who's on the other side or who should be picking up. And that's actually the purpose, is to know, I know where he lives. And actually, the people who ousted him know where he lives too. So he's in hiding. So you basically have to go and say to his neighbor, I'm looking for Abdul, have you seen him? He says, yeah, he's in hiding. Yeah, thanks, got it. Okay. Okay, finally, let me just go into this is also important because we started with World War II, the atomic war. You know, you don't want to be caught unawares in a nuclear war. But the nature of war has been changing. And this is just, we need to acknowledge that because this is actually a subtext for foreign assistance. Because armies have gotten larger, logistics have gotten more complex. When the revolution, our American Revolution started, Washington's armies were maybe 10,000. The British maybe had 15,000. Come the Civil War, we're talking 250,000 people. Come World War I, our army was 1 million people overseas. Imagine just feeding that many people, housing them. The other thing is, wars have gotten more civilian oriented. This is a picture of Lusitania, it's an illustration. You see that this is an American ship. 1,200 people died. It was torpedoed by German U-boat. it was supposedly one of the contributing factors to the Americans coming into the war. It wasn't, because this happened in 1915. We didn't enter it until 1917. But the point is, civilians are at risk in a war, and this is the evolving trend. And you see it, because this is actually, we're going to get into humanitarian aid. In World War I, 1917, August, the Germans and the French faced each other, and the Germans said, it's going to be difficult to attack frontally the French positions. So we're going to go around them by invading neutral, Belgium. So they went to the Belgians and they said, we're going to go through your country, let us take all our troops and go through your country. The Belgium says, well, you're attacking our neighbor, and we're going to have to say no. It says, well, then we'll occupy you, we'll seize everything you have. And that's what they did. They were also able to requisition all civilian food. And when the war started, Americans, this is the American first part, Americans were stuck because submarines, Germans, were floating around, shooting at anything. Boats weren't traveling, and there were, by some counts, 40,000 to 120,000 Americans stuck in Europe. No one would cash their checks. They were starving, or they just didn't have a way of getting home because all the boats had stopped going. Back then, you had to take a boat. There were no planes. Big problem. The United States government, we only have consulates, maybe with 1 or 2 people in them, was unable, not equipped to do anything. Enter Herbert Hoover. This gets into other things, but Herbert Hoover was a mining engineer in London, and he said to his buddies, who were also, he says, hey, our fellow Americans are stuck here, and some of them are, without money, they're running out of funds. Can we do something? And so they put together a fund, a private fund, and helped the Americans get back. However, it wasn't going to happen overnight. It's going to take a couple of months. And in the meantime, people were starving. They can give them money, but what are they going to buy? Where are they going to stay? And so any food that was brought in, and food started to come in from the United States, specifically for the Americans, and also for the starving Belgians. Only 25% of Belgium's food was grown inside Belgium, the rest is imported. And so the Belgians saw all the American food coming in, and they said, the Germans are just requisitioning our own food. Can we possibly work out a diplomatic solution where food comes in under the guise of diplomatic protection? And because we'll share it with you, and you'll share it with us. Besides, if you don't, there's a possibility, the Belgian dock workers may not unload American stuff. Either way, the point is, that's one of the first acts of humanitarian assistance, because American food was used to feed starving Belgians who were being occupied by the Germans. See, this is what happens. Let me just see, okay. This continued for a while into past World War I, I'm going to get into development assistance. Now, World War I changed a lot of things. At the end of it, empires had fallen. The Russians' revolution, the Ottoman Empire was no longer, and at the end, the Tsar, the Kaiser fled Germany, so the German king was no longer there. So the only one left standing was actually the British. So the Turks, the Turk Ottomans, the Habsburgs, Austria-Hungarian, the Russians, well, no more empires. So if you're sitting in either the UK or even the United States, and you're seeing governments fall because there's no food or because of discontent, you pay attention. And that's one of the reasons why, again, Herbert Hoover, a Republican, was put in charge of during the war. He was actually put in charge of the US Food Administration to prevent profiteering. He was able to basically, or try to make food production in the United States as efficient as possible. He's an engineer. As part of that, the political part, he was then also put in charge of the American Relief Administration because he had all this food and it was all American. And now it had to be distributed to starving Europeans so they wouldn't turn to communism or further upset the small developing governments they had. I put up the Sinn Féin there because if you were in the UK, you saw that the Sinn Féin had won the 1918 election, and you're thinking, at this point, Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and the whole of Ireland. And so they're thinking, you know, we could lose Ireland in and not a nice way. So a lot of countries, British included, obviously, we're thinking of, we've got to stabilize the situation, and we need food. There's an economic part to this, too. One of the problems you have when you have a lot of food production is prices go down. And then you have farmers. They were guaranteed during the war to be paid a certain amount, which would make it profitable for them. Come peace, they have all this grain. They have all these pigs. And the prices rock bottom. And so they're going to say, I'm going to lose my shirt. I've got to get better prices for this. And so the concept of what they call it, the ever normal granary. It's basically the United States government comes in, buys the stuff, and then ships it overseas. So it works out to the advantage of the American farmer for the United States government to purchase all this surplus or this excess beyond domestic requirements and send it overseas. Fulfills American needs, domestic requirements for our farmers, of which most of the United States were farmers, and overseas as well. So they killed two birds with one stone, so to speak. It works to this day too. This is something. When you buy maple syrup, they do the same thing. It's called the ever normal granary. When production of maple syrup is high, the Canadian government buys the stuff and then stockpiles it. Those giant barrels there, it's all maple syrup. Is to keep the price of maple syrup around the world high enough, but low enough for people to buy it, high enough for the producer to make money. And it's part of domestic requirement, and it's also part of good political sense. So this is the part that no one ever talks about, the political and the economic. Let's talk about the second. That's the essence of the start of humanitarian assistance as a part of foreign assistance, which is part of foreign policy, which is part of domestic policy. Development policy. Development policy is less clear, partially because does the United States have a domestic policy that anyone could say in one sentence, 2 sentences, 3 sentences? Very difficult because it is a political matter. It's not an economic matter per se. And politics means there's different stakes, different stakeholders. But from the United States point of view, this goes back to our revolution, is when we were when we were a continental set of states, we worked under, for the most part, the mercantile system of economics, which is basically raw materials go to the mother country, and they would send finished goods back. Things like finished linens, or finished cotton, or silk, things we couldn't buy ourselves, or even tea, for that matter, or iron products. The point is, mercantilism was something for undeveloped nations, and at the same time, there was a new way of thinking. It's called, this is the wealth of nations, it's called capitalism. And capitalism is basically things like division of labor, which means the industrial system, where instead of craft, where one person does everything, you have a person do a little bit of pin wire, and then one person sharpens the pin, and the other person pokes a hole in the pin. This is a real example. And that division of labor gives rise to cheaper prices for everybody. But it's a new way of thinking about how you do your economics. I put that there because this happened this book was written in 1776, and it was influential, but took hold in the United States. In the United States, we have a different system of what we call capital, not formation, but capital use. We have private equity, private individuals. We have private individuals who do little tiny syndicates, capitalized investment firms, and those are the people who do real stocks, and banks. You will not find this anywhere else in the world. In Europe, they have state banks who do things. That's why you don't see too much talk about the Dow Jones or equivalent in Europe. They don't have such things. I put this one here about individual homeowners and then investors swooping on the markets, because you have individual syndicates, 5 people, and you can see it here in Mount Dora. I see it at Tavares, where 5 or 6 people get together and they buy a home and they rent it out. It's easy to do, and that is a form of capital formation. The other one is things like, you ever see all these car washes? That's the same thing, where basically the car washes, it's a syndicate. You get 5 investors, they each put in $250,000, they put up 3 or 4 of them, and that's how the corporation makes its money, by selling you these turnkey projects. So we'll see how well they do. But the point is, it's capital formation. Now the government part. That's how individuals do it. This is the one I always talk about, which is the Erie Canal. This was a government project back in it was finished in 1828. It's called Clinton's Ditch by those people back then, because they said, he let out bonds for this, and the bonds were paid off. Instead of 20 years, the bonds were paid off in 3 years. It was spectacularly effective. It changed New York. New York City was the 3rd largest port. By 1831, it was the 1st largest port in the country. In 3 years, it went from 3 to 1. Philadelphia was the largest one then. It changed upstate New York. It changed basically the Midwest, because grain from the Midwest could now be transported across from Buffalo. Maybe I should have had a map of this. Buffalo to Albany, and then down the Hudson River. A government project. And this is the other one, which when we talk about development assistance, we talk about foreign direct investment. This is where private individuals, or usually corporations, decide to invest in a country. This is the overseas part. From a government point of view, from an American point of view, the money is not always distributed fairly or widely. And this is where you start getting not just petroleum dominated economies where there's a lot of money in the country, and if you multiply or you divide the number of people by the amount of money that's being in, everyone's making a lot of money, but it's not shared. It's not shared equally. You have people who are making a lot, and some people who are still riding camels. And this is where it's a role of government to come in, if you believe that, and say, can you change something here? Okay, let's see how let me just see. Okay, I'm just going to go on just a little bit quicker because in the United States, I've talked a little bit about humanitarian assistance. I've talked a little bit about development assistance. Again, with development assistance, it is still America first. However, we don't truly, there is a need for a domestic policy internally and also outside as a lever of using foreign assistance. And that is actually the problem we come up today, in my opinion. And this is something you can consider or not, is that we need to have that discussion. And one of the reasons why sometimes we can't have that discussion or why it's so difficult is because of there are so many partners, there's so many parts in the United States government. And this is just the federal part. I'm just giving you an idea. These are all the players that might be in either humanitarian, development assistance, or in this case, military assistance. It's also partly because of the way we structure our laws, and this is trying to help you understand why it's in such a turmoil, is the way we write our laws is you could have a law about the same topic done 4 separate or 5 separate times by different Congresses, and each law may define certain parts differently. I just put that out there because, you'll see a need for what they call consolidated laws, which is where somebody sits down and takes all the laws that have to deal with something and then put it into one binder. That's not how it's done. At the end of the year, every single law that Congress passes is put into a large stack and bound, and then that's that year's law. And then the next year, they'll do the same thing. Somebody in Congress, one of the staffers, or not actually, one of the offices within Congress, then goes through and looks at each individual law that applies to them and then puts it down into a consolidated format. And each one of these, that's where you get the titles for. Because there are 3 things for foreign relations. The first one is the Department of State. We're governed by Title 22, the United States Armed Forces, Title 10, and then you see Title 50. I already put this up here. This is inside baseball, but that's what it is. It's that every single part of the government has a requirement, and our authority comes from each one of them. Okay, this is, again, let's go back to development assistance, and I'll get into the part where the United States foreign assistance is like 1.something%, there's another slide here, of our entire budget. So it's a very small amount. And you can see comparatively that the European Union provides more than we do. And this is important when you start looking at who's in that room, who's making the rules, And who's going to call the meetings? And who gets invited? And I can't leave here without talking about the Marshall Plan, because the big one was, you can see that, was to prevent the spread of communism. Do we need, here's a question, it's a rhetorical one. Do we need to be afraid of something in order to have a program? And these are just some of the foreign assistance challenges we have today. Because there are more and more changes that we actually are not in the typical or everyday discussion. The shirts that you wear are essential for, or shirts, dresses, clothes. It's governed by a convention that brought in our articles at a certain price, sometimes at a fairer price, and it helps the other countries develop because they're getting American dollars. A good one is, I was there, Bangladesh, where you'll see entire factories, and their only purpose in life is to make clothes for the American market. And at one point, it was coming in duty-free. With a new, I guess, organization governing that, it came in at a certain tariff price, which made Bangladesh's garments more expensive. And so what a lot of people did was, a lot of buyers did, is they simply switched their buying to a cheaper country, putting some Bangladeshis out of work, and they went to Vietnam, for example. Then I go up to some of the Bangladeshi businessmen. I'm saying, so what are you going to do now that you're losing or you have a higher tariff? He says, well, I guess I'm going to go into more expensive type of clothes with a higher quality index and charge more. So they adapt, but they have the industry. Okay. And let me see, I think that's going to be about it, because I want to leave, if you want, room for questions. I think I've covered 95% of foreign assistance, but I suspect that there's going to be something else. So let me just leave it like that. The important part is that first tick is that, most of the people around the world don't speak English. And I can tell you right now that one of the big threats to our dominance is that, let's take the European Union. Britain is no longer part of that. So they speak English there, right? In Europe. No, they don't speak English. They use English because it's the lingua franca. I can tell you right now, the French are trying to change that. So you're going to go overseas, you're not going to be able to speak English. You're going to have to use French. Not kidding you. We still have a great deal of goodwill. I went to Iceland, and it's not well known, but during World War II, before we entered the war, we occupied Iceland. And Icelandics, they say, yeah, you didn't even declare war on us, and all of a sudden, you guys showed up. And we did that because we were protecting American merchant ships. That's the reason why we did it. By having our planes in the air, we protected our ships across the sea, if you saw Greyhound, again with Tom Hanks. But the Icelandics basically said, yeah, it's okay. We all know English, and you built some great airports, I've got to tell you. In fact, if you go to Vietnam, you know the one thing? Depends on, did we lose, did we win? Doesn't make any difference. They will always say, hey, thanks for these roads, these are great. Okay. And this just gives you a little bit about foreign assistance facts. It's only 1.2% in 2020. It is a minuscule part. But for the investment, in my opinion, you get a lot. You get a seat at the table. And that is the most important part. There it is. We have some time for questions, unless, please.
The big elephant in the room, particularly right now, today, is Gaza.
Is what?
Gaza. There are political considerations of Israel, political considerations on the Palestinians. What's your opinion about how the U.S., in maintaining our position of humanitarian aid, can do something to help both our friends and those who might have factions who are our enemies but have people starving?
Yeah, Gaza is a difficult one in the sense that it's actually politically driven and it's causing a humanitarian problem. And there's one thing I would tell people is Hamas illegally is in control of Gaza and the Palestinian people. On the West Bank, Hezbollah is illegally in control of the people. The legally recognized governments in both places is the Palestinian Authority. There was a point in time in Gaza where the Palestinian Authority was forcibly militarily kicked out. No one did anything around the world. So it's not an American issue, it's an international issue. If they had simply said, Hamas, you can't do that. But Hamas and Hezbollah are proxies for Iran. And that's really, this started in October 6th, 2 years ago, I think. And so that was specifically done to stop the Israeli and Saudis from basically recognizing each other, getting together. And Iran didn't want that because then they'll have two allied enemies. That's what's driving a lot of this. The other one is that Netanyahu, remember, is under charges for corruption. And so he's got to stay in power. And so he's doing, in my analysis, he's staying in power by keeping this war on. Unfortunately, the Gaza people are suffering. I don't have a specific opinion on that. One of the issues of humanitarian assistance is you usually hire the people who are working there because you give them a source of income. They're infiltrated by Hamas, and that's one of the problems. And you can't, they live there. They're under they can be subject to pressure.
They're under the
Right.
Well, isn't Hamas intercepting all the goods and stuff?
That's what I don't know, but I'm giving you the background
I've heard
from all
numerous
this.
reports to that effect, so.
Yeah.
You can't, you can blame Hamas for the people starving or whatever's happening to the people. And again, a lot of that's propaganda. I mean, the New York Times photo of a kid on the front page, and the kid wasn't starving, he had multiple sclerosis or something. I forget what the disease was.
I think it was cystic fibrosis.
Okay. That's my response. One of the things I've asked the head of the library here is to maybe have a salon series where a subject is brought up and people could talk about such things. So anyway, maybe another.
Okay. So you touched on the fact that foreign assistance, foreign aid is about 1% of the U.S. federal budget. So right now we're seeing huge cuts to that spending with this administration. So things like, for example, we have Voice America, which is our foreign news service, American news service, to kind of help us spread American news internationally. Now that that has been cut so much, we have, and I would say both sides of the aisle show that Chinese propaganda, whatever you want to call it, is an issue. Government influence. So now we have Chinese news service coming into those places where Voices of America once was predominant in these countries. So now I'm trying to wrap my head around where you have politicians on both sides of the aisle having such a concern for Chinese influence overseas and in foreign nations, but cutting and celebrating the cutting of these foreign aid, foreign assistance programs like Voices of America, where now that void is being filled by Chinese influence. So do you think that that's going to become more and more of a problem where this void is going to be filled by not only Chinese but Russian influence, where there is going to be sort of a push of anti-American sentiment?
Well, I don't know about the anti-American. We still have a deep layer of goodwill among older folk. It's the younger people. So the answer is, the Chinese way of doing things is, because they have more people, is to overwhelm and overpromise. So they overwhelm individual countries. Most of my time has been spent in Africa. So oddly enough, I would go walking around town in the local garb of the country, which is, I look totally ridiculous in African clothes. But people would come up to me and say the Chinese word for hello, which is ni hao, ni hao. And I would go, I have done more for Sino-African relations in one day than I've ever done for the United States. So they're already there. And they do it with things like scholarships to China. Where they learn Chinese, they don't learn English. You're French-speaking African, you learn Chinese and French. You don't learn English. Who are they going to continue? Forget Voice of America. American media does a good job. However, we need to do a better job of getting this out. That discussion of what you're talking about needs to be done. People need to say, what's the, I guess, the tipping point? What should we focus on? And then push that towards the representatives in Congress. Most people only look for the domestic policies. We don't have a discussion anymore about foreign policy, and that's what I'm trying to do here. We need to say, like I said, we need to be in that room in international places. We need to understand, the discussions about rare metals and raw materials are really important. And one of the reasons why democracy or stable governments is so important is for development purposes. Countries won't go into do mining of a resource unless there's a stable government there. And we need to tell the mining people that so they support our idea of getting democracy and getting English into Africa and places which China also wants to do. Hope that helps. Anything else? Harsh discussions or harsh treatment of people applying for entry into the United States legally I don't know what the problem is, but that's actually one of the problems we actually have. And this is where our representatives should say, hey, listen, you're stopping legitimate people from coming in. The getting back to things like Voice of America, if you go and look at people our age, or even 40 or 50, and you ask them what impressed them most about the United States, they will say, well, for one thing, you had this Peace Corps volunteer who brought in all these books and at least taught some of us basic English. And he's living in our village, eating our food. And I'm saying, well, I've never seen a Chinese person do that. I've never seen a Russian do that. You Americans are weird. But that's an advantage we have, is that we actually have, it's a missionary spirit, where you have people, like in this room, who go out to foreign countries and basically interact. I'm waiting to meet a Russian trying to teach, like Christianity or missionary stuff. It doesn't happen. And you will always either meet a French or sometimes a Dutch, but an American out in the middle of nowhere in Black Africa, trying to, teaching English, or doing business. I was in Yemen, and I'm trying to get away from just government stuff. I'm trying to get it to, obviously, individuals. I asked that person, so you're in Yemen, people are shooting at each other here. Why are you? And the person says, well, I'm in business. Business, when they say that, that's a code word for a missionary. But they're here, they're there. And we need to think about can't let government do everything. We need to think about how we are going to do something too. Well, person to person, people to people, and or tell our legislators to do things.
Can you recommend some good humanitarian organizations of which to contribute to
Oh,
nonprofits?
I-
I mean, I sent a check to feed the children recently. I think Doctors Without Borders.
I would go try to look for smaller ones. If someone asked me, one of the big things that's actually going to be a big problem is ordnance removal.
We're in Central Kitchen. We're in Central. Well, I contribute.
Okay. Because in Ukraine, there's going to be tons of ordnance. And it's very difficult to remove this stuff. And there are places that actually specialize in that. And I understand, yes, feed people, but what you want to do is, and I don't know the specifics, but there are organizations that actually help development, or individuals that actually help farmers.
Bill Gates.
Most of your organizations don't have a transitional part. They provide humanitarian food, and at some point, that humanitarian food part, you need to transition into good farming practices, fertilizer, better breeding stock for your animals, better farming techniques, fertilizer, things like that. We have that with our county agricultural extension people. I wish that idea we could extend to other countries. But it's hard to do, but that's what's needed in my mind. So you can do those other ones, but like I said, try humanitarian demining. Look for them on your, there's a website that does 501c3 places. But look for that, because that's going to be a big one.
They probably don't have the overhead that some of these other organizations.
Little tiny, well, the smaller ones will be a little better, a little more nimble, but they have to build up their capacities. We're always operating behind when it comes to, either fixing the problems of wars or famine or anything else. Okay. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming out today on Sunday. I appreciate it.